Number 24. What is the gospel? Is the third angel's message really good news? Continued.
For as I want to observe when we talk about healing, our work isn't done when everybody's healthy. We may just have produced a lot more healthy sinners who have a lot more energy to sin. That's not the goal at all. Everything we're doing in this emergency period is to speak as eloquently as possible about God. And it just so happens that the practice of the healing arts is one of the most eloquent ways to do this. Hence, Christ spent most of his time healing the sick. But there's a reason for doing this. And I think we have to judge everything we do by these criteria. So in sum, I see our mission as joining with the loyal angels in not doing anything new really, but enjoying with the heavenly angels, the loyal angels, in bearing witness as they did before this earth was ever created. Same message, in bearing witness to the good news about God, that the whole world may be warned, and some may even be won, to join us on God's side in the great controversy. And there surely is no greater honor and privilege than to do this.
We are trying to get the complete, full picture of God so we can relate it to others.
Yeah.
And to really say it like it is.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, now we gain faith in the Bible by reading the Bible. This is where we grow in faith. Now, in growth spiritually wise, I have heard of this thought, and I would like to read it. It says, one of the divine plans for growth is impartation. The Christian's best gain of strength is by strengthening others. He that water shall be watered also himself.
Yeah, Ellen White mentions that many times, that there's nothing more confirming to the believer than to start presenting this to other people. And those of you who've been teachers know how this works. I find in my own experience I don't really understand something until I have tried to explain it to somebody else. However, this can be carried to an extreme. Do you remember the two runners who wanted to bring the news back of the defeat of Absalom and his forces? And there was one who was more concerned about being first than having the correct information. And so he was impatient about making adequate preparation. And he even took a shortcut. And he got there first. And David said, what's the news? Great victory, he said. How about my son? I don't know. It's great tumult. Great. It's like some testimonies you hear today. It's just, well, I had a wonderful experience. And you ask what it is. I can't tell you. Marvelous experience. I hate to caricature, except it's done so often these days. They can't give you a specific message. They've just had a marvelous experience. And David said, stand aside. And the other man, who had spent a little longer to get the information, arrived. And he told the king what he needed to hear. So while it's true, you can't just say, well, I won't give the message until I'm absolutely sure I'm absolutely right on every point. I think we do, as you have read, we grow in the telling and in the explaining. But we better have something to start with. It's like our motto concerning sharing your faith, but you'd better have a faith to share. I found with Greek that when I started teaching Greek, which might seem very mysterious to many, it's actually not that complicated, but when I started teaching it, it became much clearer to me. But now supposing I tried to teach it without knowing anything about it, I would mislead. And it's like teaching auto mechanics and you know nothing about a car. I mean, what good would you be? So I think until we have the basics of our message, we should be quiet, we should be learners. But as soon as we have the basics, though there's still much more to learn, we ought to start telling it. I think there's a balance in there. Which one of us knows all the details anyway? It's an infinite truth about an infinite God, and we shall remain learners for eternity. So there's a time to learn, and there's a time to be out explaining it. And in the explaining, we, I think, accelerate the learning. Oh, I think it really works that way. There's nothing better than to try to explain the Sabbath to somebody else, and on the first occasion you may find that what you thought was so convincing to yourself just doesn't add up too well when you start giving it over the back fence, and it drives one back to the books. That's a good experience. We've all done that, surely. Now, I think there's a nice balance in that. In evangelism, this book from which we've taken the quotations regarding the reason for the delay, Ellen White talks about ministers going out prematurely, untrained, and doing more harm than good. There is a danger, she said. You shouldn't go out until you've been adequately prepared. Now, how prepared? You remember the Bible speaks of those who are always searching and never coming to a knowledge of the truth. You could sit in your study and study all your life and still feel there's more to learn. There's a time to get out. A sufficient basis for faith doesn't take that long to accumulate that we're ready to give a testimony. I just think there's a good balance in there. In fact, isn't it true that the more you learn, the more you realize you don't know and there is to learn? In fact, that's the mark of an educated person, that he realizes there is so much more to know. I mean, when did you ever know more than when you were maybe 10 and had it all cooled? You know, and then as you get older, you realize how much more there is to learn. So I think the mark of a Christian who is coming to see the scope of our message is that while he does have confidence in the essentials, he realizes there is more to learn. I hope that suggests a correct balance there. Ellen White talks about this so many times and keeps it in balance.
You know, the thought, Jesus Christ had all the basics,
Yes.
and yet not everybody was converted.
Oh, think of God, the best teacher the universe has ever known. He had his pupils in an absolutely perfect environment. He never had a student in his classroom who had a headache or a toothache or measles. None of them had a bad home. None of his pupils came from the stress of a divided home, etc., etc. There wasn't a single adverse influence there at first, was there? And yet he lost 1/3 of his pupils. Of course, eventually Satan began doing his work. But look at Satan, who stood in the very presence of God. And Ellen White says he was foremost in explaining God's purposes to the angels. He knew God that well, and yet God lost him. Now, how could God lose an individual who was so closely associated with him? That says something about freedom. That God somehow, in all his mighty power there, treated Lucifer in such a way that Lucifer felt free and even safe to rebel to God's face. You know, we think of God as a terrifying deity in all his immeasurable power. I mean, think of the power that's there. And yet, Lucifer, who stood in the presence of God, felt safe enough to start a rebellion. You know, if Lucifer had been afraid that he'd be struck down at any minute, he wouldn't have dared start it. I've thought about this more lately. What does it say about God that Lucifer would feel safe enough to start a rebellion in the very presence of the Creator? It means that though he is infinitely powerful, he is indeed equally gracious and has such respect for the dignity and freedom of every one of his intelligent creatures that Lucifer felt that it was safe to start a rebellion. I mean, he misunderstood God's graciousness, apparently. It's true, but that he felt you wouldn't do this in the presence of a vengeful, destructive deity, would you? You know, you wouldn't dare think a thought that was wrong. You would be struck down. But Lucifer thought these thoughts, and he wasn't struck down. Think how long God bore with Lucifer. And Lucifer thought, see, it's perfectly safe. Remember in the Old Testament, the people who said the Lord will do nothing? And Paul says, you misunderstand the graciousness of God. Do you not know that the kindness of God is to lead you to repentance? But you misunderstand his kindness as weakness and that he's not going to do anything. But actually, he said, you're storing up wrath for the day of wrath. The day will come when God will have to let you go and you'll reap the awful consequences. God has run a grave risk in his universe in treating us with such respect and giving us such a long time to think things through, that those of us who are inclined to take advantage of kindness have done so. Wouldn't it have been better if he'd been more of a tyrant, you know, and run this universe more like a prison? We'd have had no rebellion, would we? Wouldn't it have been better if he'd kept us all locked up in separate cells? Because who wants to live in a universe where everybody's locked up in separate cells? The marvelous thing is that those who are admitted to the hereafter will be able to live in a perfectly free society without any restraints, and they will behave themselves and respect everybody else as they respect themselves, and there'll be perfect harmony and peace for eternity. And God has paid a heavy price to keep his universe that way, and he's not going to change it. Yeah.
This might be a difficult question about potentially intelligent beings, infants who die.
Yes.
The question in Sabbath school, what happens to them? If one parent makes it and one doesn't, what is going to happen to that infant?
Well, there is a statement. Ellen White says that there are some orphans who are raised, and there are neither parent is there. However, what I would rather do, because after raising that problem, you could raise 100 others. There are lots of questions around the fringes that one could raise, and the Lord has not seen fit to give us an instruction book as to what He's going to do under every circumstance. My conviction is that God, having revealed that He is the kind of person that He is, I know for sure He will save everybody who's safe to save. And I would leave it at that. There's going to be no error in the bookkeeping. The Lord knows everyone very well. And everyone who's safe to admit to the kingdom will be admitted, young or old. So I would leave it there. And I find that a safe answer to the dozens of questions that can be raised around the fringes of this matter. Well, that would mean, for example, if one of the firstborn in Egypt who died, because God said something by that death, if one of them should be saved, well, he'll be saved. Sure, you can count on it. I mean, theoretically, if one of the 185,000 Assyrians that died outside the city should be safe to save, the Lord will save anybody who's safe to save. They only died the first death, you know, and they'll be raised in the resurrection, and when they're raised, those who are safe to save will be admitted, and those who aren't will reap the consequences. At least I know it's safe in falling back on our conviction that God is the kind of God we know Him to be, and He then obviously will do the generous thing, the gracious thing, the right thing. And I don't need to have answers to those questions. How do you feel yourself? It's the end-to-endless argument over these matters, I've found.
When our teacher was coming around, she was a very good teacher and remembered texts. You just ask a question, she'd give you 4 or 5 texts.
Yes.
And her answer to that question had something to do with the mother. If the mother didn't make it and the infant wasn't past a certain age, and she gave a text that was clouded. That's why when you started talking about people that are safe to save, well, infants up to maybe 8, 9 months, a year old, you know, they wouldn't have know one way or the other, really. I mean, they haven't proven anything, so I was just starting to wonder.
We start working out formulas upon which we think God could save this one and not that one. I think it would be well to leave that with our gracious Lord.
To my understanding, they aren't dependent on the parent at all. As I see it, I sort of go along with you that God knows the end from the beginning, and that if they're safe to save, why He will save them.
Yeah.
But I don't believe just because the mother sins or the father sins that the child is going to be.
And this is a judgment which He can better make than any of us. So I would leave it there. I really would, completely. Yes.
I think in Selected Messages, Book 2, there is a statement that says that the infants whose parents are not there will be cared for by the angels.
It's in Selected Messages, it is. That's right. I think there are 2 statements to that effect that I have read myself. Yes. Yes.
I had, since we're on the subject, I had this question raised last Monday. His marriage to the second wife,
Yes.
and she's married to him as a second husband.
Yeah.
If his wife, his first wife, is being saved, and we're supposed to be in heaven as a big family, now his question is, will he be able to be? I mean, it's not that he loves both of them, but
Yes.
he says if the both of them they are there, how can we get in a junior fight family?
Well, fortunately on that one, the Lord was asked a similar question, you know, and it's so good when we have an illustration. You remember He was asked about this girl who married a brother, and he died, and she married the next one, and the next one, married all 7. Whose wife will she be in the hereafter, the Lord was asked. And His answer was not too specific. He said, in the hereafter we shall be like the angels, and it's going to be different. And so a person might say, well, no, I don't think I'm going to like that. Well, all right, if you think what the Lord has prepared for us will not be as good as what we have now, you do have a problem. That's true. Rather, there is something different in our relationship. But then if one should say, oh, you know, I don't like that, you mean I won't love you as much as I do now? I can't think of love being diminished. It will be enhanced. Is it that we won't know each other? We have just the contrary information. We will recognize each other. We will carry our individuality, our personality to heaven, and so on. But apparently, our relationship will be somewhat different. But in any respect that it's different, it will be better. And I would leave it up to the Lord to to take care of that as I would these other things. Really, I think what Jesus did was to really ask them, please, do trust me, it will be better than what we have here. I think that's what he was suggesting. And I think on a whole lot of these things, we have to rely on that. I do. For example, many of the descriptions in the Bible of the hereafter may have thrilled a Jew of those times, but they're not the things I have in my list. I mean, even sitting under a vine and a fig tree, because I, at present, don't particularly care for figs. Some people love them. My wife loves figs, so she'll be happy there and I won't. No. Or that in the hereafter there'll be lions who eat straw like an ox. No, it says there won't be any lions there. And then do you remember in Zechariah, the picture that we read earlier, that in the New Jerusalem, or it just says in Jerusalem in the future, and it obviously is when all is restored, you will see the old people sitting there with staff in hand for very age, and the boys and girls playing in the streets. And some would say, oh, I don't like that. You mean I'm going to be old there the way I am now and even need a staff to hold me up? No, it's just that in the Bible, the hereafter is described in terms that the people of that culture would most appreciate. And you think how a Jew appreciates the family, as many Oriental people. Think how the Japanese people appreciate the family, the Chinese people. And to a person like that, and surely to many of us, is there any nicer scene than to see Grandma and Grandpa sitting there watching the children playing, and it's safe, and it's peaceful, and everybody's happy, when the family's all together? Is there anything nicer than that? In fact, what's Christmas like if Grandma and Grandpa aren't there? I get to thinking of that. I remember all the years we went home from whatever distance we had to be home with Grandma and Grandpa for Christmas. Now they're not there. We miss them. It meant a great deal to see them. Now, will they be old and need a staff of very age? I don't think so. We'll all be youthful and energetic and strong. But the Bible describes the hereafter in terms that would be appreciated by the people of that time. I think this is simply then an invitation to us to trust the Lord, to make the hereafter more than we can even conceive of. You know, even a city with golden streets and so forth, I'm not sure that would be my first choice.
That you
Yes.
repeated often, that she says, oh, what small price we paid.
Yeah, and words fail me, she says, to describe what she saw. No, there's no way. Eye hath not seen, it hasn't even entered into the heart of man what has been prepared. I would rather leave it at that. God, who created the earth in the beginning and made Eden so unbelievably beautiful, will make the hereafter even better. Yes.
There are so many places in the Spirit of Prophecy, however, where Mrs. White speaks to those who have lost their loved ones, and she said, you will be with them again.
Yes.
You will see them again.
We will recognize each other.
And so evidently there will be don't you think there will be a relationship there that will be a little deeper perhaps?
Well, the person you may have lived with for 40 years, could you ever have the same relationship with anybody else? I mean, look how you know that person, and that won't be forgotten. I don't think that could possibly be wasted and forgotten. No, there would be a uniqueness, wouldn't there, in the relationship between two people who've lived together that long?
I don't want to build a house alone.
No. Yes. Well, this is nice to think about. One thing that encourages one to think like this, you remember Ellen White's comment that we sometimes lose a great deal by spiritualizing heaven away. She said, this is a very real place, inhabited by real people, and we should not make it too vague. So in Great Controversy, you remember how it ends. She makes it very realistic, even to the endeavors that we pursue in the hereafter.
Jesus himself seems to have included a disconnection of the intimate husband-wife type relationship that exists
Yes.
on the earth.
Yes.
In other words, it would seem as though from other contexts that there will not be a male or a female as we know them there.
One could derive that from what he says, but he doesn't say much more. He lets it go at
I
that.
tell my students at school, the thing that makes us male or female is our ability to be a father or a mother, you see. And there will be no more fatherhood or motherhood, and at least and no more new fatherhood or motherhood there.
What do you think?
Well, I was just thinking that Adam's problem when Eve sinned was that he really didn't trust God.
Yes.
God could provide
Yes.
another companion for him or provide another situation or whatever that would be as good or better than he already had.
Yeah.
And so,
That's where I would like to leave it myself. I think it's great fun to talk about this and think about it. It helps us sense how real it is. But I think we will always come far short of realizing the completeness of it all. And I would rather rest my anticipations for the future on the position I have taken about God in the great controversy. Because, you know, no matter how we might describe the desirable environment that we shall live in the hereafter, if God is not a certain kind of a God, no matter how beautiful a place may be, it will be no joy to be there. So, in sum, I really think the good news, which does include the hereafter, how beautiful it will be, the good news all goes back to what we believe to be true about God, which then makes everything else good news. I've mentioned this to you before, but if you should be asked to state the position you have taken in the great controversy about God, what words would you choose to reply? If you say, I have taken my position on God's side, remember that those who burned heretics at the stake did it in God's name. They thought they were on God's side. That's not enough to say. You then would have to describe what God's side is. And the time that I enjoyed raising this question the most, as I'm sure I've mentioned to you before, especially when we read through the Bible book by book, was when with a particular group of medical and graduate students at Loma Linda, we had gone through the 66, we had studied righteousness by faith. We spent a whole semester on the latter rain alone. It was just a marvelous group. And they were about to scatter. And we asked each other at one of our last meetings what position we had taken about God in the great controversy. And did we know of any official statement that the church might have voted at a general conference? Is it in the church manual or the working policy? The position we've taken about God, not about which day is the Sabbath, etc. We have that list well printed. But the position we have taken about God, we didn't know of one, so we decided we would meet the next Sabbath afternoon and write one out for ourselves. And when we were through, it read something like this. We believe, on the basis of the consistent testimony of all 66 books, but particularly on the basis of the life and the teachings of the one who said, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. We believe on that basis that God is an infinitely powerful. That's not enough to say. The devils believe that and it scares them. We believe that God is an infinitely powerful but equally gracious person who values nothing higher than the freedom, the dignity, and the individuality of his intelligent creatures, that their love, their faith, their worship, their willingness to listen and obey may be freely given. Of course, the basis of freedom is order and self-discipline, mutual love and faith and trust. I mean, what freedom would there be if order should give way to chaos and we find that we worship a capricious, untrustworthy God? Of course, it follows that if I choose to be disorderly in God's orderly universe, if I choose to be unloving and untrustworthy and disrespectful of others, then I will begin to lose my freedom and to reap all kinds of undesirable and destructive consequences in this life and ultimately in the end, but not at the hands of our gracious God. His cry over the perishing ones will be the cry of Hosea, why will you die? How can I give you up? How can I let you go? Then when we present God's law and his requirements, we will want to present them in such a way that they obey him with a higher sense of freedom. More than that, we would respect people's freedom to disagree and to vote no and to turn it down, though we would care very much if they go away, and we too would cry over them, why will you die? How can we give you up? How can we let you go? And we felt this would affect everything that we do, the way we live ourselves and the way we present the good news to others. Before we're through for the semester, I wish maybe we could share with each other words we might have chosen individually to describe the position we have taken in the great controversy about God.